ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again. It's a great pleasure to be with you, those of you here in the room, but also our virtual audience, so welcome to you. This afternoon, in the next 45 minutes, we're going to be talking about sustainability in the tourism and travel sector. My name is Tanya Beckett, I'm moderating, and I'm now going to introduce you to your guests. Please welcome them. Dr. Paul Peters, Professor of Sustainable Tourism Transport at the Centre for Sustainability, Tourism and Transport at the Breda University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands. Welcome to you. Kerr Whiteley, who's Sustainable Hospitality Alliance. Do you want to come to the stage? Yep. And Dr. Suzanne Etty, who is Environmental Impact Specialist at Intrepid Travel. She is, yes, please take those. She's joining us from Australia, and thank you for her stoicism in staying awake at this time. And of course, Harold Goodwin, who's WTM Responsible Tourism Advisor. Welcome to all of you. Excellent, we have our link with Intrepid and Australia. She is indeed Intrepid joining us through this technology. Thank you very much once again. So, Dr. Peters, we have heard so many times that aviation is a big challenge for the tourism sector. What is it that tourist companies can do about this problem of carbon footprint?
Yes, thank you for this question. Indeed, if you look at the total contribution of aviation to tourism's emissions, then it's 50 to 70%. If you look at the contribution to total tourism trips, then it's 20%. So it's quite a lot for a relatively small sector. Before I can answer what the tourism industry should do, you should have an idea of what the aviation industry should do. And there have been many proposed measures and pathways like battery aircraft, offsetting biofuels, waste fuels, wonder beans, improved fuel efficiency, more efficient engines, higher bypass ratios, laminar flow, carbon fiber wings, better ATC, more efficient ATC, the ICAO CO2 standard, CORSIA. The problem is that none of those are good enough. And even together, they are way too little to get the emissions to zero by, say, 2050 or very close to 2050. Actually, the pathway to zero emissions for aviation is very narrow. It consists of, in the long term, we need those zero-emission aircraft, and those are not battery-based. They are based on a mix of hydrogen, fuel cells that make electricity out of hydrogen, and then electric engines. And maybe some will fly directly on burning hydrogen. But that's a very long pathway. 2080, at the earliest, the whole fleet might be replaced. The current fleet of 26,000 aircraft, they do only burn one thing, that's kerosene. So we must have an alternative for kerosene that's not made from fossil oil. They call that a sustainable alternative fuels, SAF, and those SAFs, biofuels are an example, but they have a whole range of sustainability issues. Waste is a short-term, maybe an efficient way to use that waste, but in the long term, certainly not. And it makes us dependent on producing waste, while we need to reduce waste to get to the goals of Glasgow.
You're not sounding terribly optimistic at the moment.
Well, there is a third way, and that's making the alternative fuel directly from carbon dioxide. It costs a lot of energy, and that's the bottom line of the problem. But you can do it. They call it e-fuels, and the process is power to liquids. It's a well-known process. 100 years ago, they started already working with this. If we do that, flying will become more expensive. But the problem here is the energy, because you need to do it with wind energy, solar energy, of course. And we do not have that much of it. So it will limit the growth, and that's the third pillar. We must adapt the growth of aviation to the possibilities of the technology, not the other way around.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we'll come back to how close we are to some of these technologies becoming viable a little later on. Meanwhile, let's come to Claire Whiteley from Hospitality Alliance and ask what the hospitality industry is doing, by which I mean from an infrastructure point of view.
Yeah, that's a good question. Considering the fact that about 80% of buildings that will be here by 2050 are here now. So we really need to look at kind of retrofitting the buildings that we have already and the infrastructure that is there. In terms of the sort of highest impact areas within a hotel building, about 70% of energy use goes on heating, ventilation and cooling. And water heating, and then also cooking meals. So anything that is done within that area is kind of the most impactful. This year, IHG, one of the big hotel companies, released a study which was looking at how you can decarbonize a hotel. The main aim of the study was looking at getting to net zero, but the key point that they found was that you can actually, through on-site measures, reduce by 75 to 80% the amount of carbon that a hotel uses.
A couple of those key measures, what might a couple of those key measures be?
A couple of those, the sort of the easiest option and the cheapest option is control and monitor. So looking at how you are running a hotel. For example, when you have guests checking in, if you haven't got a full hotel, you can make sure that you're kind of clustering what rooms you put them in so that you're not having to heat the whole hotel. And then also on the sort of more technical side of things, you can do active measures, which is essentially upgrading equipment, installing new equipment, which either uses less energy or uses electricity rather than gas and other fuels which have higher carbon. And you can actually, through the active measures, you can reduce carbon by about 45% by doing things like installing new boilers, upgrading air conditioning systems and things like that. But there is one caveat with that, in that if you do install technology, you need to make sure that the people who are using it know how to use it properly.
Yes. Because
otherwise you can install, the best building management system, but if people don't know how to use it, you can see that the savings aren't what you'd expect. Or, for example, we've seen in some hotels where they installed intelligent ventilation systems in the kitchens and the consumption actually increased because the chef just put a pot of boiling water on the oven to kind of keep the ventilation going all the time. So you need to make sure that you're working with the team members that you have in the hotels.
Chefs, you can't trust them. Well, that sounds very positive and a lot of measures there. Let's come over to Suzanne Etty, who I've said a couple of times now, is joining us from Intrepid Travel in Australia. Intrepid Travel, I'm sure you're aware, takes small groups, but with a big focus on improving the communities with which they work. And it's the largest operator in the world of its type. What can tour operators do, Suzanne? We've talked here about buildings, we've talked about airplanes. What about operators themselves, operators like you?
With you all virtually from Melbourne. Yeah, I think a good way to explain this is probably to explain this actually in the context of our science-based target. So just for context, Intrepid has been carbon neutral since 2010 and also became in 2018 one of the world's largest travel business to be a B certified B Corp, which means we balance purpose and profit. And we're seeing certainly more companies committing to carbon neutrality, and that's really great, but being carbon neutral is no longer enough. Based on the fact we really know today, we would be lying to ourselves if we were just continue as though being carbon neutral is enough for the travel industry. And we certainly have seen over the last 15 years since then that climate action has grown more obvious year on year. And so in January 2020, we actually declared a climate emergency with Tourism Declares, which is a global collective of tourism businesses, organizations, and also individuals who have pledged urgent action on climate change. What is important in the context of your question is that our emergency is underpinned by a 7-point commitment plan. And that includes the measurement of emissions to go 100% renewable in all our offices and a commitment to ambitious emission reduction targets. And that's done through the Science-Based Target Initiative. And that really means that we are setting science-based target in line with a 1.5 degree future that we need to aim for. And we will reduce our greenhouse gas emission at a pace, but also scale that science tells us that is really necessary to limit global warming to 1.5. So how are we actually doing it? Since 2020, we have our science-based target verified by the SBTi and became the first global tour operator with one. An important part of this question is really that we, as a tour operator, are actually very asset light. So we don't own most of our supply chain. So we need actually to work very collaborative with loads of different businesses to address our Scope 3 emissions. And that's actually all the emissions associated, not with just our business, but that we are actually indirectly responsible for. So that's up and also down our value chain. And that includes, for example, business travel, employee commuting, used sold goods like leasing of assets, including cruise ships, flights, and within trips. And because transport emissions are amongst our biggest source of greenhouse gas emission in our emission profile, it is really about that transition away from fossil fuels and moving to hybrid and ultimate EV vehicles. But it's also really about reducing flights, and that's across the business. So speaking about business travel, but particular for the product, and also providing our customer with these low carbon itineraries. And so, yeah, maybe I stop here and then.
Okay, Suzanne, that's interesting because I think it puts collaboration at the heart of it. That is, you're saying you are asset light, so you're not in direct control of things, but you can insist that your suppliers adhere to certain standards. Which brings us, I think, to you, Harold, rather nicely, because businesses, there does need to be a commonality, there does need to be a standard, a reference point, somewhere where they can go to get advice.
I think that's absolutely right. I think what Suzanne's example from Intrepid demonstrates is that where you've got a company like Intrepid, and Intrepid's not alone in this, but they have been leaders in it. When you've got companies like Intrepid saying to their suppliers, we really want you to be squeezing carbon emissions out of what you're selling to us, then you begin to get change. And let's just make the comparison with what's happened in supermarkets in the UK and elsewhere in the world. The supermarkets were aware that their consumers wanted to buy more responsible, more sustainably produced food. Surprise, surprise, that's what we get, because the pressure from the tour operator or the supermarket puts the pressure on the suppliers to change the way in which they produce the product. It's exciting for me that I know that Booking.com are about to come out with, later this month, they'll come out with a whole system on their site where the hotels are actually explicit about what they're doing on carbon and a lot of other sustainability issues. And of course, Google have just come out with a very useful search engine so that consumers can look at the carbon being emitted on their flights, but so can a tour operator. So the information is beginning to be out there. And Claire, you might want to comment on what we know is coming from the hotels around the zero carbon initiative, which will be announced again later this month.
Yeah, there's a few things coming. Firstly, in terms of zero carbon that you mentioned, there's a methodology being put together at the moment, which is looking at how to accurately measure carbon emissions, and it looks at who within the value chain should be responsible for which piece of the puzzle, as it were, because as Suzanne mentioned, it's very complex when you're thinking about kind of all the different stakeholders that are involved, particularly or specifically thinking about hotels. You have the building owners, you have operators, you might have a brand who is entirely different because it's a franchise property, so taking that into account. And then also within the Sustainable Hospitality Alliance, we are working on creating a kind of pathway for hotels specifically in terms of what they need to do to get from kind of the starting line, which the majority of the industry is at, because the majority of the hotel industry is independent small hotels that, you know, are run by a family or a small company, and then looking at the different stages that they need to take to meet net zero, but also to go beyond that, because we don't see net zero as being the end of the journey. We need to be looking at having a positive impact rather than just kind of reducing our negative impact.
Right, and this is something Suzanne said as well, is that net zero is not enough. When you say a positive impact, could you give me a couple examples of what you mean by that?
So, for example, we should be trying to get to a point, particularly with things like biodiversity, where we are regenerating biodiversity. We've had such a negative impact on the wildlife out there, on the habitats out there, that it's no good to stop destroying them. We need to kind of bring them back. And then in terms of things like water, we can be replenishing water as well as just kind of reducing the amount that we're using.
Suzanne, can I come back to you again? When you say net zero is not enough, what sort of things might you do and your company do to try to add something back over and above that?
Yeah, no, really good one. One, I think, is, and that was already mentioned, the measurement side, to really understand, otherwise you can't reduce. And that's where the reduction side comes in. So, for example, for the top 50 most popular trips, we are actually now reviewing those by 2022 and aim to have all flights under 19 minutes swapped out for low carbon land, road and alternative. And that's a clear direct carbon reduction on those trips where it's obviously viable. A good example also around that maybe in this context is really good, a project, a most recent partnership which we have with the Blue Carbon Lab, which is run through the Deakin University here in Victoria in Australia, which is all really about restoration of wetlands in the bay or wider area of Melbourne. This is also a project that is done with First Nations in conjunction with them.
Just for clarity here, Harold, for a moment, do we put into almost one bag the environment in terms of biodiversity, for example, and local employment and local communities, or do you see those as two separate things?
I think that there are a couple of issues which are, if you like, global in their impact, and one of them is obviously carbon emissions, because that affects the climate for all of us. The other is any plastic which gets into watercourses and ends up in the oceans. Most of the other issues, to be fair, are local, and the priorities will vary from place to place. But the carbon one is so critical because it's the climate change which is going to drive a catastrophe for humanity if we don't make progress. And if I might, Tanya, push us back in a slightly different direction. One of the things about the travel and tourism industry is that the tour operators can do a great deal. The hotels can do a great deal to retrofit. But the truth is there are hotels being built now which are not being built low carbon. There are aircraft being purchased now which are not going to be fit by 2050. If you take the German research seriously, and I choose to do so, but it's not academic, it's commercial consultancy research, basically says on current trends, by 2050, aviation will be responsible for around a quarter of all emissions. That will be a catastrophe for us as a species, but it will be a bigger catastrophe for the tourism industry. We have to get on top of low carbon or zero carbon flying. It isn't an option. It needs to be addressed now.
So what you're saying is the rest of the world has this success, you know, it starts to look like a sore thumb.
Yes, absolutely. And what will governments do then? Most people don't fly ever in their lives. If we still live in democracies by then, the implications are clear. The cost of flying will be astronomically higher than it is. The aviation industry has to get on top of this. It's no good just messing about with small changes like carbon offsetting and SAF. They've got to get on and make the big change.
So this has been back to you. How close are we? You've said there are a lot of things that really are not delivering close enough. They're just not delivering enough, and if you put them all together, they still don't deliver enough. But we're still some way away. Perhaps you could say what Airbus has said about this.
Yes, Airbus is looking very much at the hydrogen fuel cell solutions that I mentioned, and then either electric or burning the hydrogen. So, but of course, the current aircraft they produce, they will fly the next 40 years. And so within 30 years, we cannot solve it by that. That's very obvious. Another thing that Airbus and also Boeing is doing now, they are looking in that aircraft can handle 100% alternative fuels. Currently, they are allowed to only handle 50% for safety reasons. But that will change, and that will change quite quickly, within a couple of years. But then, of course, you need still to build all those factories that create those e-fuels, that can produce those e-fuels, and that will take time. In theory, at least, if you get into an S-curve of developing that, which is the normal way that new innovations come into the market, then initially, the first 10 years, you don't see hardly anything. It's a couple of percent in the end of that period, but then it starts to boom. But we must start today. Otherwise, it will be another 10 years before it starts.
Can I assume that you are disappointed by the developments in the aviation industry in this field?
They could have started 20 years ago, I think, because much of the technology was already there, but not at that moment fit, and it has developed very slowly.
So why has there been a lack of incentive?
Well, that's, I think the main issue is, there are a couple. The first one is that aviation is not part of the NDCs, of the responsibility for emissions for countries, as agreed in Paris. So it's set aside to an international organization, the UN ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. But that organization has a very big stake in the industry, in the economics and the safety of the industry. And they are not really able to hurt the industry because of the environment. And I've been in that process as a consultant, and it doesn't work. So they came up with an offsetting system. They call that climate neutral growth, which means that every additional emission after 2019, and currently they are lower, so there is none now, but in a couple of years there will be additional emissions because of the growth of aviation. That will be offset, that will be reduced by other parties, like in forestry or that kind of projects. Of course, you never get to zero by such a proposition, and you keep the emissions level because you do only the additional ones and not the current ones, which every year add up. While we know that we need 50% reduction in 10 years' time. So it's a daft, a dangerous proposal from a UN organization. And they mean it serious. And maybe the tourism sector should simply say, we do not believe in CORSIA. Let's stop it. An airline that pays for CORSIA is not my airline.
Suzanne, coming back to you, you were talking about trips that were carbon neutral. And I came very close to booking one just before I was talking to you. I was looking at your lovely website. The problem is that people still have to fly to wherever it is to start the trip. So this must really concern you, this discussion.
Yeah, no, definitely. And for that reason, we have, I guess there are two things. One is we have more walking and cycling tours now, and they're in constant development. So, but which in itself obviously provides a much lower carbon emission profile for those trips. But directly to your point, Tanya, is that we are actually offering now a lot more domestic tours, and that's in Australia and New Zealand, but also in the US, Canada, and in the UK where you are. And that really means that travelers from those regions can actually now, they don't need to catch that long haul flights to experience a proper intrepid group tour that still involves the local leader, authentic experiences, and public transport is widely used on those tours. So that's our step, how we're really supporting our customers that want to fly less, who want to make it count, that they have something that they can explore domestically.
Yes. Harold, do you think ultimately the pressure will come from the customer?
I think the customer wants to purchase a trip which is guilt-free. So to some extent, the pressure comes from the consumer. But what infuriates me is I can't buy a zero carbon or even a low carbon flight. It's not possible. There are some things I can do. I can fly direct. I can fly on a charter flight, which means there's more people on the aircraft, so my actual carbon emissions are less. But in reality, the aviation industry is not offering me the choice I want, and that's the frustration. And it won't change until the tourism industry says, up with this, we will not put. Get your house in order. Look what happened with cars. Yeah, it didn't take very long, did it, for the technology around cars to completely change. And it changed because the government said it's going to change by this date. Get on and solve the problems. And now we've got Formula One with electric cars coming. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that if they release the amount of money that's being spent on what I think are just short-term fudges, if they put that money into the tech with the engineers, we begin to make the progress. But they're not putting the pressure on the airlines to change, and that's for a lot of that is to do, I think, with national flag carriers saying that we really don't want to change. But for tourism, it's a critical issue. Because if you think about the position of the Gambia, it's all very well, Suzanne, talking about domestic tourism in Britain or Australia. There's a domestic industry, where there are domestic travellers who will travel. That's not going to happen in the Gambia or much of the Caribbean. Those countries are heavily dependent on tourism for their foreign exchange earnings, and the only way people are going to get there realistically, given the holidays we have, is by flying. The responsibility is on the airlines and the aviation industry, and particularly the engineers, to change the way we fuel aircraft. That's what needs to happen. And it needs to happen now, without all kinds of excuses about carbon offsets and cooking oil and biodiesel and goodness knows what else. We need those changes to happen.
Suzanne, are you a little surprised sometimes that when I book a flight, it's very absent from the dialogue that I'm having with the airline that I'm booking the flight with? Does that surprise you?
No, it's like I'm nodding completely, not a lot what is being discussed amongst us. So yeah, no, it is definitely what Harold has said. We need that real collaboration and action now, no further delay. And customers need to have those choices, because it's correctly stated that domestic really works only in certain markets, and that's where customers have a choice, but other areas also really depend on tourism to return and customers to arrive.
Suzanne, also I'm very intrigued by the idea of this carbon neutral outing, this carbon neutral trip that you offer. Do customers really respond to that? Do they book it on that basis, do you think?
Yeah.
Or is there some sort of grading?
I think it is maybe the first time they book. They book because the trip looks interesting. They want to do the specific trip in that region. But then through the trip and afterward, they're really learning about sort of how we are sustainable pioneer in that space, that our trips are carbon neutral, how we're going about it. And also nowadays we're communicating a lot also in the context of COP26 is around our science-based target, and that we're actually reducing. Because as I said at the start, is carbon neutrality is not enough. That doesn't actually reduce your overall carbon footprint. It is really about setting long-term reduction targets.
But back to you, Claire, what are your thoughts on this idea of how tuned in the customer is? And there'd be sort of, I'm imagining a sort of grading system where a customer can build it into their choices.
I think customers are much more interested now than ever, particularly given the conversations that have been had over the past few years, just generally around the environment, whether it's plastics or discussions around climate. And so I think they are much more interested in selecting hotels that are doing something about it. As Harold said, until now there hasn't been a particularly great way for them to do it, but it is coming. And then I would say the other angle of that is the corporate customer as well. So a lot of hotel rooms around the world are booked by big corporate companies who are using it for their business travel. they are asking a lot of questions of hotels about what they are doing, what their carbon emissions are, how are they reducing them, and it's really starting to kind of creep up the list of priorities. And if you have two hotel companies who put forward a proposition, if one can show that they're having a lower carbon impact, then they could well get the business because of that. If they've got similar pricing, that could be the winner. So it's worth doing it from a business point of view.
A lot of the retrofitting that you were talking about, to me, sounds quite expensive. Is there a chance that hotels or franchise and so on at this stage in the game might say, well, we've just lost a lot of money and we can't afford to do this? Is there a pushback?
There is pushback. However, I would question whether we can afford not to do it. Yeah. Because firstly, from the kind of the individual business standpoint, you know, we've seen recently energy prices are fluctuating.
Yeah.
So much uncertainty. We just don't know what could happen with that, and their energy bills could skyrocket. Yeah. So to future-proof from that point of view is wise. Then you've got the fact that asset values actually increased. If you're putting the new technology in, it's increasing the asset value. If you do nothing, then over the next few years, your asset value will decrease.
Yes.
So they're quite important pieces.
Tanya, could I just add to that? Because that's absolutely right, Claire, clearly. But the other thing to say, I think, is that the payback period now, if you talk to people like Eric Ricorte at Greenview, the payback periods are getting shorter and shorter, and actually it does now make commercial sense to invest. The other point two other points I'd want to make. One is that the investors are increasingly worried about the carbon efficiency of new hotels, and we've got to retrofit because there's an awful lot of embedded carbon in those buildings. To knock them down is going to emit a lot of carbon, and building again is more carbon. So retrofitting has to be the way forward. I don't think there's any choice but to retrofit. What is so infuriating, though, is that people are building hotels now to not carbon efficient. That's just nuts in terms of the way the world is going. And that's a failure of regulation by local governments, really, to insist that only carbon efficient buildings are built.
You've mentioned another interested party, and that is investors. I mean, that they clearly have a role to play here in terms of applying pressure.
Well, if you look at the pressure that's coming from big investors like BlackRock, but several of the others as well, are now saying we will only invest in things which are environmentally sustainable, and that's about flooding and about carbon emissions. And obviously for them, those two issues are intimately related. So a lot of the flooding starts with carbon emissions.
So let's come back to this question of airplanes again. Is there a way that some of the research or some of the building of planes, because it's very worrying what you're saying, that planes are being built now, that of course, how long does a plane live for? 30 years, 20 years?
At least 30 years.
At least 30 years.
And the problem is designing an aircraft, a new type, that takes normally like 5 to 10 years. Then it's built for 15 to 25 years. So we are already at 40. With the technology of 40 years ago, the last one is built. And then the last one is flying still 30 years. So it's like 70 years.
But some of these sustainable fuels can work with existing aircraft.
Yes, and that's the direction we need to go. And the engines will be turned out
modified, yes.
more often. So then you can modify them or take a new one and fly 100% on those fuels. And so if we get those fuels for 100% by 2050, you have solved the problem. And then the volume of aviation basically becomes a function of how much of that fuel you can produce, not the other way around. So I see now studies, and they say...
Sorry, explain that
Yeah,
once again.
I can try to explain it. Normal studies look at, okay, we have population growth and economic growth, and so in the end, in 2050, so many people will fly so many kilometers. And that will be so much of fuel that you need. You should turn that around. You should say, okay, how much of the e-fuels can we produce in 2050? And how much can you fly on them? That's it. So you turn the discussion around. And so therefore, I'm very happy to hear that domestic is now your booming market, which was it already for COVID, but I hope you maintain that spirit. For instance, for Europe, there is another market that was already booming before 2020, and that's the rail market. There were growth numbers like 10, 20, 30, 40% even on certain connections. And what I was surprised for is that so many tour operators neglect those railway passengers and those railway clients, while first it's booming, second it's quite difficult to organize it yourself, so that's a perfect position for a tour operator, because a tour operator makes things easier for the client. So that should be the main market, but most seem not to see the market or are ashamed for it or maybe afraid, I don't know. So the rail market is really an alternative. Also because the long-haul market is a tiny bit of the total tourism sector. Domestic is already 80%. So
I think it's very easy, Tanya, looking at it from Europe, to see the railway industry is lagging really behind. But if you look at what's happening in Japan and China, particularly with high-speed rail, genuinely high-speed rail, not this nonsense that we have in the UK, then you begin to see that aviation will be struggling to compete with the rail. But rail has to meet all its costs, and aviation is subsidised. So unless we change the cost structure, we won't see the decline of aviation that we need to see. But the other point I wanted to make in support of Paul, for a change, is that I did an interview with Jane Ashton. It's on the on-demand programme here. And Jane is talking about this is EasyJet's plans for purchasing aircraft. What she said very explicitly is we are going to be buying aircraft over the next 10 years, which we know we can easily retrofit to fly with hydrogen.
Yes.
So the more enlightened airlines are already beginning to think about this. And I think in that sense, Paul, I'm a little more optimistic than you. It's a strange reversal between the two of us, but I am feeling a bit more optimistic.
Well, Suzanne, this is quite interesting. I mean, this is not necessarily your area, I suppose, but this idea of the pricing issue between rail and air travel, is that something that touches your world?
Yep, it does. Good that you're asking this one. So, for example, in China, the trips that we're doing in China, we are already now have replaced the internal flights, so the flights within the itinerary that I'm referring to, with the high-speed trains. So, yeah, that's definitely a big part of our decarbonisation plan, because as I mentioned, those emissions all fall under Scope 3, so our value chain. And that's a really first step for us, is where we can replace flights with ground transport, and especially in countries where there's good high-speed trains available, it's a logical next step.
It is the case, surely, Harold, that given what we've been hearing about the technology, that simply tickets will become more expensive, air tickets.
I think so. I mean, there'll come a point when people become a lot more worried about climate change. And even now in the developed world, where people thought perhaps it wasn't going to affect them, and it was just going to be I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but a lot of people did think, well, that's just something that's going to affect the developing world, I'll be all right. But, you know, the flooding we've seen in London, what we've seen in New York, what we've seen, I mean, just driving into London yesterday, there was standing water on the road coming up the A2, which is supposed to be a major road in the UK, and traffic at a complete standstill. I mean, the realisation that climate change is going to impact on our lives is becoming a very real phenomenon for more and more people. And they will start to think about the implications of that. Flying is already, for the younger generation, it's already something they are thinking really hard about, and Greta Thunberg's done a great job in that. But it's not just Greta, that's a sense of revulsion, really, against something which they see as highly polluting. And they're right.
Claire, I guess if you own a hotel, the problems of flooding and so forth, the impact of climate change are very real to you already. You don't need reminding.
Yeah, definitely. And the industry has definitely been hit by climate change, the impacts, whether it's flooding, as you say, or droughts, the likes of the Cape Town drought that happened a few years back. The tourist industry as a whole in Cape Town lost out on about $65 million worth of income because of that impact. So we are seeing it directly. And then when you think of a lot of, I guess, resort destinations, island hotels and things like that, if we see sea level rise, that their entire property could be kind of wiped out, put under sea. So it is definitely a concern.
And Suzanne, some of the communities that your travellers will visit will also be seeing the impact of climate change.
Absolutely, and they're seeing already the impact from droughts, floods, and other extreme weather events. And we're seeing it also with tours that we have to reroute because of bushfires, for example, 2 years ago when we had the mega fires here in Australia. So again, yeah, we're getting directly impact as a business, but also obviously the destinations and that we love to visit.
Which I suppose, Harold, means that many tour operators or hotels and so on operating communities probably end up mitigating a lot of the time.
Absolutely. I mean, the industry is, particularly through aviation, responsible for some of the climate change. But as an industry, we are dramatically affected by changes in the weather. And we can't ignore that. We both cause the problem and suffer from the consequences, along with the communities who live there. And that's much more important than what happens to the tourists.
Okay, I'm just going to get a final thought from all of you, if I may, before we wrap up. Suzanne, let's start from you. A bit of optimism as to how the industry is tackling this problem of sustainability.
I guess it's twofold. It's around measuring and starting the conversation today within your business and with partners. And what do I mean with that? It's really, one is around you can't reduce what you don't measure. And I've definitely seen that over the last years. There are very few travel companies that really understand the impact they're having on the planet. So it's really around the critical step of measuring and then reducing your emissions. And the second part is really, no matter where you are in your climate journey, make it really a priority to take the next step to translate your commitment into action, especially with COP26 that gets underway in Glasgow. Today, the travel sector is actually coming together with a shared commitment to accelerate climate action in tourism, because this Thursday, the Glasgow Declaration on Climate Action in Tourism will be launched at COP26, and that's really where everyone in tourism is encouraged to join the nearly 200 destination companies and organizations that have already signed the declaration when it became live last week. So the more of us that make this shared commitment, the more momentum we really will build together.
Measure it and do it together. Harold?
Absolutely.
If I may, an advert, a trail for tomorrow. We've got a session in the Tech Theatre with 3 people talking about the opportunities to use tech to address sustainability and responsible tourism. If you want to hear about changing people's behaviour, that's a very good session to come to.
Interesting.
That's tomorrow morning, 10:30.
Tomorrow morning, 10:30, you can hear more about technology designed to help solve this problem. Any positive thoughts from you, Claire? Because I know that we're going to come here and not hear any.
You're afraid.
Yes, I think from the hotel side, I would say that the most positive thing happening at the moment, both within hotel companies and kind of the value chain there, but also across the wider industry, is collaboration.
Yes.
And Suzanne mentioned there the Glasgow Declaration, with people have come together and kind of laid out a pathway. I think there is a bigger move, I guess, towards different companies working together, whether they are different parts of the value chain in terms of the hotel, the airline, etc., or whether you're looking at the owner-operator chain kind of angle of it.
Okay, and finally, any positivity at all from the airline industry, or the aviation industry, I should say more precisely?
Or the behavior of flying, maybe we should talk about that. We did a study once, or a colleague of mine, and he measured the happiness that you derive from your holiday.
Yes.
And then he plotted the happiness against the distance you have flown. And you feel what's coming. There is no difference if you go short haul or long haul. So really, we can reduce our distances and then reduce the problem directly tomorrow without becoming unhappy.
Measure happiness along with everything else, as well as your carbon footprint. Thank you very much indeed to Suzanne, Claire, Paul Peters, and also Harold Goodwin. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm now going to hand over to Matt Walpole. Matt, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.